Ladies and gentlemen, Walter Hawks.
Summer journey. Good morning. Summer journeys to Niagara and to other places aggravate all our cares. We'll save our fares. I've a cozy little flat in what is known as Old Manhattan. We'll settle down right here in town. We'll have Manhattan, the Bronx and Staten Island too. It's lovely going through the zoo. It's awfully fancy on old Delancey Street, you know. The subway charms us so as balmy breezes blow to and fro. In July, sweet push carts gently gliding by. The great big city's a wondrous toy, just meant for a girl and boy. We'll turn Manhattan into an Isle of Joy. We'll go to Greenwich, where modern manage to be free. And Bowling Green you'll see with me. We'll bathe at Brighton, the fish you'll frighten when you're in your bathing suit so thin. We'll make the shellfish grin, fin to fin. A short vacation on Inspiration Point we'll spend. And at the station house we'll end. The city's wondrous enough a toy, just meant for a girl and boy. We'll turn Manhattan into an Isle of Joy. We'll go to Yonkers, where true love conquers in the wilds, and starve together, dear, in Childs. We'll go to Coney and eat bologna on a roll. In Central Park we'll stroll, where our first kiss we stole, soul to soul. A short vacation on Inspiration Point we'll spend. And at the station house we'll end. For civic virtue cannot destroy the dreams of a girl and boy. We'll turn Manhattan into an Isle of Joy. All right, that was 1925. It's not so much about what's changed, it's what's stayed the same. This is 1923. From the same composer that brought us God Bless America. Yes, that was right. God bless America. Oh, I got a message from below. 'Twas about a man I used to know. About a year or two ago, before he departed, he was just as happy as can be. I tell you what he said to me. He said, if ever you get heavy-hearted, pack up your sins and go to the devil in Hades. You'll find the finest of gentlemen and the finest of ladies. They'd rather be down below than up above. Hades is full of thousands of Cohens and Browns, or hooligans, Cohens and Bradys. You'll find a heavenly tune that went to the devil because the jazz bands started picking it, put a kick to it, a jazzy trick to it. You'll find a couple of old reformers in heaven, making them go to bed at 11. Pack up your sins and go to the devil, and you never have to go to bed at all. If you get to dwell where the weather is hot, H-E-double-L is a wonderful stop. If you need a rest cause you're out of sorts, Hades is the best of the winter resorts. Paradise doesn't compare, all the nice people are there. They come there from everywhere just to revel with Mr. Devil. Nothing's on his mind but a couple of horns. Satan's waiting with his jazz band and his band. Came from Alabama with a melody hot. No one gives a damn is music or not. Satan's melody makes you want to go to bed, and you never have to go to bed at all. You'll find a heavenly tune that went to the devil because the jazz bands started picking it, put a kick to it, a jazzy trick to it. You'll find a couple of old reformers in heaven, making them go to bed at 11. Pack up your sins and go to the devil, and you never have to go to bed at all.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephen Cassell. I'm the chair of the Van Allen Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to a live recording of Person, Place, and Thing, featuring really the wonderful architect David Adjaye. It's programs like these and music like this that I'm happy to be a part of the Van Allen. We're a 120-year-old organization that through public programs, research, and competitions really ask questions about urban life and create dialogues within the international community and the community around us. So tonight we're going to hear from Randy Cohen, the former ethicist columnist for the New York Times and the host of Person, Place, and Thing, discuss with David one person, one place, and one thing that has inspired the architect. So we just enjoyed a performance by Walter Hawks, who will be performing again tonight between segments of the discussion. And this evening is just one part of a series of programs by the Van Allen that we're hosting as part of our fall festival, Periphery. So upcoming programs include Peripheral Proposals, Models for Commuting from the Margins of Tomorrow. That's with the NYU Rudin Center for Transportation. And then Van Allen Book Club on Tuesday, a group discussion on Patti Smith's new book, M-Train. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Randy.
So David, who's your person?
Okay, that was a great introduction. The person I chose to talk about today was a dear friend and somebody who really inspired me, a man called Charles Correa. Charles Correa was born beginning of the 20th century, early 20s, and really came to prominence in the 60s. And he's important to me because, in a way, he is of a generation post-war that was grappling with this idea of identity and place, of a new nation. India had just become a new independent nation from the British colonial rule. He studied at MIT, so he was one of that sort of generation that also was born in India, came to America, studied, and then went back to India to really take part in the sort of idea of nation-building architecture of his country. And very quickly he rose to prominence. He was a very skilled and talented architect. Rose to prominence and really started instigating a very serious investigation both into the urban life of what was going to become and what was becoming urban India, and also to investigate the notion of what could be an architecture of that region.
I read something that he said about Mumbai as it was becoming insanely big and insanely crowded, and he said, market forces do not make cities, they destroy them. Do you find that to be so?
This is an eternal discussion. There are architects on both sides of this. I had recently had a conversation with a very well-known British architect who said,
Come on.
well, actually with Patrick Schumacher.
Okay.
And Patrick Schumacher is convinced that actually you should get rid of government and let market forces completely take over, because he thinks that that's where the most radicality happens.
Oh, yes, you've been to Utah? Arizona? How does he like Arizona? It's really beautiful there. And you know what's as beautiful?
It's a spirited debate.
There was something else, though, about Charles Correa that put me very much in mind of you, and it's what you were saying about questions of identity. And I know, am I right, that he wanted to repudiate Orientalism and colonialism and conceive an architecture that was Indian?
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean?
I know. I mean, I think that there was something a little bit problematic about the notion of an Indian architecture, because that's, for me, I mean, I think it's very tough, because the idea of India is a kind of modern construction, and the identity of India is a kind of it's a kind of fiction that's made up to make a nation, and it's a beautiful thing. But then to try and make architecture kind of make that. Have a sort of place of that. I think there's something about a regional architecture that's very interesting, that is explorable, which is to do with the way in which cultures of a certain region of that part of the continent developed, and how the sort of geography and climate of that particular part of land has affected the evolution of cities and of urban life in that region, irrespective of what you call that. So I think that there's an investigation there, and I think he caught up in the India project. It became Indian architecture, but I think that's what he really meant. I'm intervening.
Well, but I think there's another aspect to this too, that I was reading that he was interested in natural ventilation systems that were very traditional in that part of the world. So you wouldn't need air conditioning. And he also worked with traditional craftspeople, and that put me in mind of you. You've done that too.
No, he was really one of the early proponents of really looking very seriously at the vernacular of a region, not just as a kind of trope, but just as a real archive of knowledge to then develop modern techniques. So successful sometimes, not so successful others, but this idea of a kind of investigation into the body of history which makes a place seems to me very smart. I'm very fascinated by this idea that we have, if the city's maybe been around for about 10,000 years approximately, since the agrarian revolution.
You made a gesture like I was going to challenge that figure and say 9,500, sir.
Just checking if there are any experts out there.
This is a room full of architects. You have to be very cautious.
I think that this idea that there's this incredible sort of wisdom that builds up from the sort of migration of the species on the planet, and the specificity of working through place and that kind of ecology is a kind of a very smart science, and we should no longer kind of see it as a kind of a history that's sort of the past, but as a kind of living history that we can absolutely reinterpret for the complexities of our time.
Yeah, but the living history, as it actually confronted him, was pretty bad.
The living history was poor. It was a lot of poverty.
Here's another Correa quote that I really liked, which didn't remind me of you in any way. I just liked it because it's bleak, and he's about ready to jump in front of a bus. He says about Mumbai, he says, every day it gets worse and worse as a physical environment and better as a city.
Yeah, it's great.
What do you make of that?
It's amazing because, he recognizes the sort of the passion and the fissure and the kind of imbrication that makes city life so fantastic to all of us, and also the things that make city life annoy us, like pollution, homelessness, immigration, sort of, poverty, and all those kind of things that are, so the kind of the extremities of what he's talking about, the horrible smell, but the beautiful kind of collision, the person that you see, it's those wonderful things, and he talks about that all the time. But India is a kind of, if India is maybe a model of maybe a kind of future as our populations increase and people migrate to cities, that this idea of dense cities are going to be real for all of us, and what does that mean and how is that negotiated?
You know that book, that Suketa Metu book, Maximum City,
Oh,
also
yeah.
about Mumbai.
Yeah.
And one of the things he observed about Mumbai was that he thought the people there were they're all new arrivals.
Yeah.
It's just what you were talking about,
Yeah.
that move from the countryside to the city. And he said they're all in flight from something or in pursuit of something. And that changes the nature of a city as compared to, say, a city where people
Settlement.
are settled.
Absolutely, and there is the kind of the modern rupture or the modern project, because the city is again another fiction. It's an agglomeration of people for a particular desire or a particular. It might be a response to an industry, or it might be a response to Bollywood, or it might be the old trading port where the governments were, etc. So there are many forces that make the city that are quite abstract or quite artificial. But then in this sort of rapid agglomeration, what is the image of the city and how is that made? I think it's fascinating. It doesn't decouple it from the issues I think that I spoke about.
I feel, sort of in the interest of honesty, that the kind of end of the Charles Correa story is that he in a sense fled Mumbai and moved across the harbor, right?
Well, he designed a new town across the harbor, yeah. But he still lived in Mumbai until he passed away in June. So he very much dwelt in the city. It traumatized him, but he dwelt in it. But he was part of an urban think tank for the government. He was part of master planning, and he was completely horrified that developers would ignore these. There was the kind of failure of the master plan. The master plan was a great Beaux-Arts invention that we could master plan the city, and then people would follow the rules, and then it would all be beautiful. And in a rampant hyper city, the rules get flouted, corruption takes over. Things happen, and so there's this image of the city that he's frustrated with because he wants it to be one thing and it's not. So he decides to create another city across the bay, and it's a very beautiful idea, but it also sort of fails. But it's this idea of a kind of a settlement that allows a rapid housing to be made, low cost. It kind of deals with the kind of middle class and the working class, but the density's kind of flawed, so it collapses.
Was he repudiating his earlier commitment to the incredible unplanned vitality of Mumbai by going for a planned ground-up city? Was this like and the late stages of his career, like an old man's folly? He's like King Lear.
It wasn't quite the late. I mean, he was ranting about it till the end, but I think it was
ranting is already a King Lear thing.
yeah, ranting is very King Lear. No, but he. I think Le Corbusier was actually a kind of a sort of meteor or a sort of asteroid or a celestial body that kind of warped a lot of architects at that time. His influence and him building Chandigarh became a kind of this sort of trope that they all thought they had to kind of match or create a counter to. So in a way, this idea of not, I think that there was a kind of distraction, and I call Le Corbusier, it's very grand of me to call Le Corbusier a distraction, but in a way, he was a kind of, this idea that he could lay out an entire city was just so attractive to that generation of architects. They just couldn't believe it could happen. So they all wanted to do it, but it's not that easy.
Can you think of a single example where people are really happy to live in such a city?
Actually, you know what? I was in Chandigarh beginning of this year, and it's an amazing city now. It's very interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, the government quarters are caught in gridlock, so there's a sort of Berlin-like wall between two parts of Corb's project. There's the assembly and the sort of government secretariat building, and there's a dividing political line with guards. So it's sort of shattered politically. But the diagram of the city is becoming really interesting because the notion of the grids and the quadrants have now more or less filled out, where they were just sort of very strange follies, probably in the beginning. And there's a kind of very interesting, vibrant life that I thought was starting to activate. In a way, what it showed is that the city can't respond instantly. It takes a couple of generations. The things have put in, and it takes a while for it to.
Is it that the master plan is kind of a framework, and then actual real human life has to take over and demolish the framework in some ways? Or I guess if you design, what about this then? If you design a good framework, that vitality is possible. But if you cling too tightly to the framework, you're doomed. It's lifeless.
Well, that's also a very interesting debate about urbanism. People always cite Paris, let's say, and Haussmann. So Paris and Haussmann is a very ordered, super controlling diagram. It's one material, it's almost one height, it's almost a singular language, and it's relentless. But people say it's the most beautiful city in the world. So there's the trope,
But has it been? Can you think of examples where it's been repeated? I mean, people aren't saying that about Brasilia. It's the most beautiful city in the world.
You just asked me to name an example.
You gave me one, so now I'm backpedaling like crazy. Yeah.
Okay, the 20th
No,
century.
you
The
wiped
20th
the
century has
floor.
had some problems, but actually, Brasilia's is I guess exotic and unique. I mean, if there's another character that I really adore, is also Oscar Niemeyer. But Brasilia is interesting because in a way, the government quarter is a kind of sort of probably one of the most excellent examples of the virtuoso techniques of the 20th century. There they are played out. The way you make a vault, the way you make a soaring tower, the way you make colonnades and arcades and gardens. So it's a kind of arsenal of the types that you could make in the 20th century. So in a way, I think it's actually a very romantic model. I mean, the mall is a kind of a very failed urban project, but in the sense that it's supremely cold in the winter and supremely hot in the summer, and there's nowhere to kind of shade. It's kind of just a bleak landscape mostly. I mean, I'm being, that's always the argument.
Yeah.
You talk to people, and it's just like we don't have anywhere for people to actually kind of respite in this long landscape. So in a way, that kind of maybe in the utopian project, there's a kind of failed. It's not really about the kind of human thing. It's really about the kind of representation of culture and of idea. So maybe sometimes we sort of seem to put importance on that, and that's important to us to make an image of what we sort of aspire to. So, it's hard to say that they fail. Maybe they fail on a kind of day-to-day basis, but they sometimes don't fail on a symbolic level.
Well, if you're going to insist on being optimistic and upbeat and
have
have
to be
faith
an
in the
architect.
future, Americanized. Gosh, again, have you been to Arizona and Utah? We should take just a moment, and we'll be right back.
When a man is broke, believe me folks, it ain't no joke. When a man is broke, believe me folks, it ain't no joke. Just like Humpty Dumpty, he stays broke. When you've got a thirst, puffing dust with every breath. When you've got a thirst, puffing dust with every breath. Find a river, drink yourself to death. I got the down and out blues, the doggonest blues. Certainly got the best of me lately. There ain't no doctor, can't find no remedy. I sell the down and out blues. What can I use? Certainly got me up a tree greatly. There ain't no druggist can't end my misery. But I ain't got nothing much. Shoes is all such, hosiery, hats or clothes. And there ain't nobody cares, nobody shares none of my worries or woes. I dream of steam-heated flats, welcome doormats, and a sweetie I can't lose, never. But when I wake up, I got the down and out blues. When your shoes are thin, every step gives you a pain. When your shoes are thin, every step gives you a pain. once they're gone, you're on your feet again. When a man is blue, when a man is blue, lays down on a railroad track. When a man is blue, lays down on a railroad track. A nice girl passes, he pulls his head right back. I got the down and out blues, doggone his blues. They certainly got the best of me lately. There ain't no doctor, can't find no remedy. I said the down and out blues, doggone his blues, certainly got me up a tree greatly. There ain't no druggist can end my misery. But I ain't got nothing much. My shoes is all such, hosiery, hats or clothes. And there ain't nobody cares, nobody shares none of my worries or woes. I dream of steam-heated flats, welcome doormats, and a sweetie I can't lose, never. But when I wake up, I got the down and out blues.
Walter Hawks. So, David, do you travel with a band usually? It's
Love
better,
to.
right?
I would love to.
Much better.
Yeah.
Where's your place?
I guess we're going to move to Sugar Hill, Harlem.
Tell me more. I'm intrigued.
No, I mean it's not because of anything other than it's a place where I just recently completed a project, but it's also a part of the city that I didn't know about until about 5 years ago, until I started working on the project, and just discovered the incredible rich history that it has and the relationship it had to the kind of evolution of the city and how it developed. You know, it is kind of almost the highest point of the city of Manhattan is this incline that goes from Wall Street and up to that point. It was the escape from the slums of downtown to the sweet sort of farms and scented gardens of of Sugar Hill. And it also, during the sort of Harlem Renaissance, was the place where all the intellectuals would reside and respite. It was a place to kind of to go to. So, even like the site that I worked on, until recently had a car park that, Duke Ellington parked his car in when he was, performing in the area. That was his kind of public garage, and it was a well-known spot. So it's very fascinating to me that this upper part of Harlem has this incredibly charged social, cultural, political history. And there's a kind of renaissance in Harlem, and it's at the lower end, but in a way, this upper part of Harlem is also part of this very rich history, which has contributed to the identity of America. Which I
It's
love.
quite a list of people who lived, within, 5 feet of where your project is. Take the A-Train, Billy Strayhorn, Duke Ellington. They lived there. That's why they're writing about their subway stop.
Correct.
Who else? Oh, W.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, Adam Clayton Powell, Frankie Lyman to drag the conversation down just a bit. Willie Mays to drag it back up again. Langston Hughes. It's Paul Robeson, Count Basie. You can go on and on and on.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing
It's
that you walk
astonishing.
to the store to get your paper, and that's who you'd run into.
Can you imagine? I can't even get my. And when I sort of discovered this extraordinary history, I was completely floored because it's really not spoken about, and in a way that I think that area is a sort of cultural heritage zone very much that needs to come into its own.
You should explain, to the people who aren't lucky enough to live in New York, where Sugar Hill is.
Sugar Hill is it's on the east side, so it's up in the 150s. The sort of area I'm talking about is sort of between 150 to 160,
I'd say, because I live here.
Okay, go for it.
145th to 155th, would people
Okay.
agree with me? And Amsterdam to Edgecombe. I mean, there's not like official, what does official
It's
mean
not
in this
official,
context?
yeah.
But that's, if you wanted to say to someone, this is how you get to Sugar Hill, well, that seems about right. Can I have the support of the room? Thank you. Unless I'm wrong, in which case I don't want your pity. Well, I kind of do. Are you aware that in some ways Harlem isn't Harlem? I mean, no place is the same as it was 50 years ago, but Harlem seems to be particularly undergoing some real changes now.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting that Harlem is, I mean, you know, the sort of dreaded word that people don't like anymore, gentrifying. But you know, it's interesting, this notion and this rail against gentrification. I was sort of in a panel just having a discussion about looking at gentrification of cities and how actually, if you look at New York as a whole, if you look at the areas that are being gentrified, it's a very low percentage. So it's interesting that this story of gentrification gets a lot of attention. Actually, developers only target certain areas and don't do enough. They should do more across the entire city to regenerate it. And the story shouldn't be, for me, about gentrification. It should be about looking at the kind of alleviating of poverty and the kind of upgrading of really badly built, infrastructure that's in the city, and how that gets modernized, brought into the contemporary, brought into the now, and improved. And so in a way, I used to be kind of like, oh yeah, this is a really bad thing, but I've totally flipped my position that the conversation is not about gentrification. Good for it. You know?
I don't believe I was the person who introduced the word gentrification. I just said
flipped it
Harlem
on
was
you.
changing.
I know. It was implied.
I don't think it was.
I know what those words mean.
Could we have the bailiff read the transcript back? I didn't mean that, but I mean, clearly, I mean, of course you're right. There are economic forces underway that are irresistible, and I like your distinction. So gentrification is improving an area for people who don't live there, and what you're talking about is improving an area for people who already do live there.
Correct.
Will you buy that distinction? But we're not going to, I mean, I don't know if you've spent a lot of time in New York or in the United States, but that's a hard thing to accomplish.
I know. It is a hard thing to accomplish. But, you know, I mean, I think this model of the growth of the city is never static. It's always dynamic. It's always shifting. You know, every decade there's a new agency and a mood. And yes, there are places that have generations of families that, you know, create identity in those places. But it's never forever. The city's always changing. It's alive. I always say the city's a live body. It's perpetually growing, changing, and it shifts. And it's a very long view, and it's a kind of, maybe it's a romantic view, but it's also one that I think allows for things to shift and mutate. I mean, yes, you know, there are losses always, and the city is actually a very cruel place too. It's sort of, if you're not smart with it, it kind of drops you down as it kind of marches on. But if you're also able to kind of hold on, it can take you to amazing places. You know?
Again, optimism. I don't know. This is very hard.
I'm
for
going to
me
have to tank
cope with.
it afterwards. I'm going to shift.
All right. But there's another aspect of the history of Harlem I think we haven't touched on yet, and it has to do with race. I mean, one of the reasons Harlem was because this incredible group of accomplished people, well, they couldn't buy apartments anywhere else in New York.
Basically, yeah.
Don't you think that was a big part of how Harlem became Harlem?
No, absolutely. It was the only place they could make a settlement, because they weren't allowed to live in the so-called developed neighborhood. So this was the kind of new ghetto where, you know, the white community was not at large. So, you know, the black community was allowed to reside there, and by default, that melting pot also then created this explosion. Which is the sort of the Afrofuturism, I call it the Afrofuturist explosion, or the Afromodernism, that sort of, you know, radicalized a lot of things.
Right, you're not just speaking about architecture.
No,
you're
I'm
speaking
talking
about
across the
literature,
entire
music,
spectrum. The entire spectrum.
Dance, can go on and on and on.
Yeah, it goes on and on.
Well, I guess in America that's what we call our culture. I mean, that's a pretty big chunk of it.
Yep.
But what happens, I think, inevitably, it is the downside of assimilation, and that's an American story too. It's that immigrant groups come, they have particular enclaves because they don't feel welcome other places.
Yeah.
And as you become assimilated into American life, well, those enclaves vanish. So that Yorkville used to have the biggest German population in the United States. It was, I think it was the biggest German neighborhood outside of Germany.
Right.
Well, I mean, Yorkville, it doesn't look like anything. I mean, it's just another part of New York. Now, the Lower East Side, where my grandparents lived, it's much, much less Jewish. Little Italy, barely Italian. Little. So no one would argue for the perpetuation of racism, but is there a cost? Is it unfair to say there's a cost that comes with assimilation?
No, I think that there is a cost, and the cost is a kind of loss, a memory loss. And I think that memory loss is at the scale of the urban as well as literature, as well as the dialogues that are had and the certain lives that are had. Now, what do we do about that? That's a whole other project. But I think that the city, I mean, I keep going back to this notion of this abstract thing, but when you kind of come together like this, it does force this shedding. But I am troubled by the way in which assimilation creates memory loss of your past, like 2 generations away. Not that you should hold on to it like a sort of, thing on your back, but I think that, the notion of the narratives of what different peoples are actually perpetuates or kind of encourages a kind of richness. And I think it actually creates incredible, that sort of, in a way, it creates these kind of different ways of looking at the world, which actually contribute, when brought together in this kind of cluster, the community of the city, creates invention, creates new things, creates new possibilities. I really believe that.
Memory itself.
I think memory and patterns can actually, and I'm very much interested in that as well. Patterns.
Wait, what do you mean by patterns?
Just patterns of life, patterns of ways of living, ways of being in the city. I'm always sad when the city kind of creates singularities all the time, herding people towards a kind of singular way of living. And I think that's the sort of destruction and the death of the city. I think that when it unfolds different possibilities and it allows different mutations to occur, actually I think it creates invention and richness, because it forces invention and richness by not denying, but actually by encouraging new sort of flatterings, if I can call that. And I think that's really exciting, and great cities that allow that, I think, gain from it.
But can memories not also become dead things?
Yeah.
Where they completely lack that vitality?
Totally. It's a dangerous thing I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Very dangerous thing. Because, whose memory, what is the collective memory? Whose identity? Which group has the kind of say on, what is where? And in a way, what I'm not looking for is a kind of consensual memory, because I'm sort of worried about that. But I'm sort of interested in the way different memories, even the kind of disjuncture in the memories, even the fictions within the memories, because memory is full of lies too. It's full of things that we apply in it.
Well, it's a creative process.
It's a very creative process. But I think that all that is really great creative soup, because it actually allows extraordinary vitality to occur. I'm interested in the creative potential from memory, not what memory represents. Yeah.
I'll tell you a scary story, or at least it scared me, but you don't seem as cowardly as I am. I have a friend who works at the Apollo, and this is a project they're working on now, an interactive hologram of Billie Holiday.
Ooh.
Yeah, thank you.
Ooh, interactive.
Interactive.
Hologram fine. Interactive.
Oh, that's where you draw the line? Hologram fine?
Hologram fine.
But
yeah.
Once you've done that, doesn't that, aren't you now saying, well, we're a museum, and a museum is where you collect relics. And this particular relic, I mean, it's kitsch, isn't it? And that's part of what's wrong with it, but part of it is, well, go home and listen to the records. It's wonderful. And doesn't this make it, it freezes it as a kind of dead thing, it Disneyfies it?
I think that, you're leading into another very important discussion, which is about, the nature of, museums and histories and stories. That's, I guess.
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that. but this idea of a kind of Disneyfication of culture and memory is a really interesting one, because where's the fine line? When does it fall over, and when does it actually activate relationships? I mean, I think that for me, a hologram is not problematic because a hologram just simply is a medium of a new generation. It's just the medium of a new generation. Children being born now in 30 years' time won't think anything of holograms. So to represent in holograms,
You're just saying I'm old, aren't you?
I'm basically saying we're not the relevant ones. We're kind of not the ones it's meant for. But the idea that you somehow just freeze Billie Holiday into a series of cliched comments is then, that's a problem. I mean, I think if you can use that to kind of allow, a new generation to see Billie Holiday a new way and to kind of access to Billie Holiday, then I'm all for it. So, this idea of Disneyfication is a really fine line. Who's Disneyfication? It's interesting, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I should say, in defense of these people, that the latter version of this, and I see typically the generous spirited version of this, the interpretation you had, where it's a way of presenting history to people that's meaningful and lively and rich. That's absolutely what they intended for, and it may just be a mark of what a horrible person I am that I see this as sketch, and it'll all work out great. No, it won't. Let's take 1 minute while I cry myself to sleep, and then we'll be right back.
You must take the A train to go to Sugar Hill up in Harlem. If you miss the A train, you'll find you missed the fastest way to get to Harlem. Hurry, come on now, it's coming. Listen to those rails a-humming. All aboard the A train. Soon you'll be on your way to Sugar Hill in Harlem. Hurry, get on now, it's coming. Listen to those rails a-humming. All aboard, get on the A train. Soon you'll be on your way to Sugar Hill in Harlem.
Walter Hawks. So David, what's your thing?
The thing is the corona on the Washington Mall. It's the idea of the object, the sort of skin of the building that I'm completing on the Washington Mall right now. I mean, maybe everybody already knows all about this, but first explain what the building is, and then explain what the corona is. Okay, so
I mean, I read all the memos, but these people, they've just been drinking all evening.
Sorry. The Corona is part of a building that I'm working on right now that will open next fall. It's the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's a project I've been working on for 7 years. It's the last. It'll be the last museum on the Washington Mall grounds. It's the completion of a 200-year master plan to create a series of palaces of culture on the mall to talk about American culture, and the story of the African American community, their migration from the story of slavery from Africa to America, the great migration from the south to the north, and now is sort of encapsulated. Those three parts are encapsulated in this museum, and it's intended to be a museum that allows Americans to look at the African American experience as a lens to understand America.
And now explain how the Corona fits in.
So the Corona is really is a way in which is what we describe the body of the building, and we use this term Corona because I in working on the project made a reference to an artifact that comes from West Africa, that comes from the forest region of Africa, which is this ziggurated form which looks like a crown. And that crown is, as a silhouette, is sort of its DNA is the main image of the building. As you approach it, you see this ziggurating form, which looks like a corona, and we've sort of coined this term corona, so that's the thing.
Does this take us back to Charles Correa a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's a loop here. I think that
That's why I earn the big money, by the way, because I can make those kind of connections.
Good.
Thank you.
No, in a way, what's been amazing for me working this project, working with Lonnie Bunch is the director of the museum, and this whole journey would not have been possible without him, because really his insights have been incredibly instrumental in developing the building. But the corona and this idea of a building which is not just about making a container which sits on the mall and then gets filled with things, but is part of one thing and that the insides are part of something else, was something that we wanted to challenge right from day one, that we wanted to make a different kind of building whose very silhouette would activate an inquiry about what was going on here. And in a way, the reason for the notion of the silhouette, which is not a sort of Western canon sort of strategy, but actually a West African strategy of the profile of the architecture denotes the importance of the thing, became very interesting, because in a way one wanted to see, was there a way of talking about the way in which assimilation or the way in which information transfers from one place to another, and what happens to it and how does it get resolved. So this form, which is actually usually on the capital head or the column head of shrine architecture. It's really it's almost like the Corinthian column of this kingdom. And the reason why we sort of selected West Africa is not because I come from West Africa or anything like that.
Certainly not. I would never suggest it, sir.
I always think it's not autobiographical.
It's not a royalty deal or something.
No, it's no royalty deals with Benin. But actually, the Du Bois Institute, Henry Louis Gates' incredible institution, kind of did a lot of research, and what is clear is that almost the entire African American community comes from the forest region of Africa. The forest region is the body of forest that sort of is north and south of the equator. So we're talking about from Dakar right through to what is now Angola as the predominant area, and that is all forest, known as the forest region. And that forest region sort of birthed many kingdoms. It's really where the 4 great rivers of Africa kind of emanate from, so all the great civilizations and cities, we know cities usually sort of appear near rivers, all flourished in these areas, and the craftsmen of these areas, sort of some of the highest craftsmen were in Benin, in the Yoruba kingdom. And so, in a way, I have this myth or a thesis in my head that, creative people steal great ideas. That's what we do. We borrow and steal and we manipulate them and reshape them. So I would imagine that since these guys in Benin were really the good guys, people would be copying them, right, in different modes and forms in different places. So I just had this idea that this form must have been actually quite a special form in the 17th century, in the 16th century, if you knew what these things meant, or if you had been allowed to come near shrines. Depending on the structure of the society that you lived in. So there was something nice about saying that maybe could that, that science now come to this, I call Washington the sort of northern end of the tropical part of America.
Yeah.
It is kind
if
of...
you've ever spent a summer there.
It is really tropical. So there's a kind of very interesting relationship between American tropical and African tropical.
Wow.
So in a way, this is a kind of translation of another tropical condition. But also the form, which is explicitly an artifact or a kind of detail of a building, also makes a relationship to the Washington Monument, because, and that was just incidental. We discovered that as we were doing it, because it's an inverted. It's 3 pyramids interlocking into each other, and Washington's monument is an obelisk with a pyramid on top. So it was perfect, and our building is the last building next to this. So in a way, we realized that there was a dialogue of pyramids that we had stumbled on, and as though L'Enfant, the great master planner of Washington, had set out the narrative of the classical language, from ancient Egypt right through to the Egyptian classics, and there it was. So in a way, we felt like we were finishing his narrative, his fiction. So yeah.
Lonnie Bunch, the museum's director.
Yeah.
he said that the one question he was asked more than any other, is this building going to look African American? What does that mean?
we always get that, and we you know, we don't know what that means, but all we can do is say that it encapsulates this, or it takes its cues from the stories. Now, what you call it in the end is up to you, and we're actually not interested in that, and I know that Lonnie's not interested in that, but what Lonnie's very interested in is that every part of the building activates stories, activates inquiry. So hopefully when you're looking at that form, it's not a building which is about the virtuoso skill of the 21st century kind of creating something, because we can. It's the virtuoso skill of the 21st century creating something that has this incredible link to something 400 years ago. And our ability to do that now because of the technology and the science that we have, and to make a very large version of something that would be very small. You know, a bronze cast would be very heavy, very delicate. We can mass produce it with special aluminium, recycled aluminium that's hydrated and coated in a special bronze so that a builder can lift one up, you know, as opposed to 10 people sort of carrying panels.
Oh, so those elements are on a much, much bigger scale
Yes.
than the original
Much
metalworkers were made.
It's a bit of a Klaus Oldenburg moment.
Well, it's a weird question, because, you know, Renzo Piano's New York Times building, well, it doesn't look newspapery.
No.
I mean, if you just looked at it, you would have no idea what goes on in there, or well, if you read the paper, you sometimes wonder too. But you know, but I love the paper. I love the paper, but it's, you know, it has its mysteries.
Yeah.
Or like the Calatrava's transit hub, which I think is incredibly beautiful. Yeah. But when you look at it, you know, this thing, you wouldn't say, oh, train station.
No.
So why should that be imposed on you?
Yeah. No, it wasn't imposed. It was actually something we ran to. And I think that you know, I think in architecture there's a way to look at it where, you know, there's architecture that plays at different, that signifies different things, you know. Why does the Capitol look like the Capitol with a dome? Why does it look like it's something out of Florence? Why does it look like a cathedral? It's got a cathedral top. It's got, you know, a temple base. It's these. So in culture, and things that are to do with high culture, we want to have a kind of narrative that in the form. And yes, we can say no, we don't need it, and we can try and find the 20th century idea of a kind of form follows function narrative. But form follows function is fine when you are talking about sort of utilitarian things, but very difficult when you're talking about ideas. You know, so how do you make ideas follow function? And that's really the question. So yeah.
Were you mindful of what we were talking about earlier, that how do you collect memory without killing memory?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's an incredibly delicate balance, because it's always about the translation, and it is a bit of a skill, and we trust people to be interpreters of that, and we judge them whether they're successful or not, and, you know, we either sort of, you know, give them a thumbs down when they don't succeed, or we give them a thumbs up if we collectively agree. But I think that this idea of translating information, and sometimes ruse information, is very delicate, but it's all about the way in which it's reappropriated and repositioned. And I think that the invention in that repositioning is really very important. Because in a way, if you're able to remake the thing so that it speaks anew, it's able to kind of have a kind of resonance with the kind of the people or the civilization that it's kind of emerging in, then I think that there's a kind of success in it. You know?
How much were you told about what was going to be in the collection before you started? Like, you're to make this box, they're going to put these things in. Did they tell you a lot about what the things would be?
The collection was happening as I was making the box. So it was really a very, you know, we knew there was going to be a certain amount of things, but in a way the collection has been growing, and the last 7 years has accelerated to anticipate the building. So it's one of those unusual things where the collection and the building are both born at the same time.
I mean, it seems a particularly eclectic collection. I just jotted down a few. There's a segregated rail car from the 50s, I believe, shards of stained glass from the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, a hymn book carried by Harriet Tubman. These are all reverential objects that are just so filled with meaning and history. Then we get to the mothership that George Clinton and P-Funk took on tour as a prop top. It's a bit of a shift. I'm not making that. And a convertible owned by Chuck Berry.
Chuck Berry's convertible. It's fine.
Okay, so go design something that will
There you
contain
go.
all that. They seem that we have very different emotional responses to these. Some seem more
Totally.
frivolous than others. I think it's fair to say.
Totally. And I think what's amazing about the story, what I call the narrative of the African American community, is that it's not one story. You know, people tend to think of just slavery, but it is an extraordinary 200-year history, which really, in its kind of mutation and its evolution and the way it's impacted the world, is extraordinary in terms of what civilizations do in the modern world. You know, for me, it breaks down into a tripartite. There's no irony that the building is in three. You know, the symbolism of the building is three tiers as well. That it is the history gallery, which is really the narrative of coming, as I explained, from Africa to America and migrating, etc. Then there is the Great Migration, and you know, the Great Migration is really not understood in what is called the Great Migration, which people like Jacob Lawrence, you know, the great artists, sort of illustrated. This idea of freedom from the land and the ability to go to cities and to earn one's living and to become part of the citizenry of this great country. And this incredible sort of trajectory that happened from the South into different corners of America and sort of infusing these cities with this new world was a very powerful moment as well, as powerful as the kind of transition, in a way, from Africa to the South. It was this idea of becoming part of the urban, you know, the urban life, the urban elite. In a way.
And
It's a massive shift again.
That book Dick Lemon wrote, I guess it's called The Great Migration,
Right.
that I thought his sort of brilliant crystallized idea was, well, it was just, he paralleled that to any other immigrant experience.
Yeah.
Where you're going from, now you're going to this new place. There will be a different food,
Yeah.
there will be a different language,
Yep.
there will be a different climate,
Yep.
and you may not see your old friends and family again,
Exactly.
ever.
Exactly.
It was like 19th century immigrants coming to America.
Absolutely.
It's profound.
Profound. Yeah. So anyway, that middle passage for me was incredible for me to understand and to really come to grips with. And then the last part is the now. It's what's happening now, and the sort of the contributions and the kind of the diversity of the African American experience now and what it is, and trying to understand that. So in a way, these three parts are the three canons that are the anchors of this. And I knew that from the very beginning, and in a way, those are the things that have organized the building. The history I chose to put in the ground. So the history gallery is actually buried in the ground, and it's under, our site used to be a slave market, which was extraordinary as we did the research to find out that it was right there just behind the White House. There was a slave market right there. And so we, you know, through dialogue with the Fine Art Commission, et cetera, had to position and move the building to an acceptable, you know, politically correct moment to align with key things, which we were very happy to do. And what we were very keen to do was to create a landscape that would honor that site where that slave market was, and we put the sort of the history galleries underneath that as a kind of plinth in a way, or as a body underneath that. And then to make that a garden. It's now, when you come to it, it's this sort of northern garden that allows you to look to the memorial grounds, to Lincoln's sort of temple, edicular structure, the reflecting pool, etc., before you enter the building. So it's sort of, yeah. And then the other two parts are up in the corona. So in a way, they're separated by the foyer. The foyer is the void which you come into, which allows you to see all directions. And then you descend into history and you go up into the upper.
The past is underground, like archaeology.
It's kind of like an archaeology. And it's a way of kind of bedding it into the soil. Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking to us. You'll take some questions from
Yes,
me.
absolutely.
Before we
Thank
do,
you.
would you join me in thanking Walter Hawks and especially David Adjaye? There are some mics. If you put your hand up, one of them will be brought to you, unless you're really far away, and then.
So you've done a few, I know that you've done a residential project kind of surrounding a collection of art on the Upper East Side. We did a project kind of on the same block. But is there a piece of art that inspires you as an architect, one, and number two, as a person?
Oh, wow. There's I sort of rejected architecture school. So I went to art school. I kind of went to an art school to study architecture. There's a small group of us. When I was it was at the Royal College of Art in London. When I was there were only 10 of us as architects in sculpture, painting, school. So I became very interested in art and its relationship to architecture. But there are so many practices that I love, and I don't look at art necessarily in terms of artifacts, though there's some stunning artifacts, but I look at it now in terms of practices. What I love about contemporary art is the ability that they have to continually reinvent their notion of practice and to make it relevant to the time that they're in. And I think that is a really powerful lesson for us all. Literature does it as well, but I think architecture gets kind of lost in its history and its objects. And we find it difficult to understand how to translate into the future. It's a really tough thing for us. So in a way, I don't want to give you an object because that would deny what I'm trying to do. I'm interested in you looking at art as different modes of practice to understand the future.
But it was nice of you to come up with a thing, and not just an abstract idea.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the question about how the African American Museum is a museum about African Americans, but further, like how it's more than just a museum about African culture, it's a museum about African American culture, by choosing the symbolism of a Yoruba crown that relates to the origin of the African American experience. But I'd like to hear you talk about how that relates to, how that engages with the experience of African Americans as slaves in America.
Absolutely. Firstly, I think that the museum is actually an American museum, actually. So I don't call it an African American museum. It is the kind of title, but I know the director and the curators all talk about it as a quintessential American museum. And that's very, very deliberate and very specific because it really talks about the diversity of what America is. It's not a singular monolith. It is quite a quilt that comes together to make this incredibly unique country. And the idea that a Yoruba motif can be American speaks to the relationship between Africa and America. Absolutely. It's since that encounter, there is no cleaving away that moment. It's part of it, and that community is here, and it has contributed so extensively to the identity of America in terms of all the things we've discussed. It's been absolutely instrumental in it. So the Yoruba motif is really taken as a silhouette, but actually when you go into it, the detail of the structure is made up of lessons learned from African American ironworkers. If you think about the time of sort of the emancipation from slavery, the crafts that were available to African Americans, the only professions they could go into because they were not allowed to do anything was, there were farmers, because that was about the land. They were woodworkers, because they had to repair things, or they were metal workers, again, creating or repairing or adding to things, or working on buildings, essentially, the infrastructure for those farms. So in a way, what's interesting is that of those three, metalworking and its relationship to architecture became very interesting because the people that were capable of doing that were deployed to build parts of Louisiana, Charleston, all the way up to Washington. Slaves were very much, or free slaves were very much part of that construction architecture. And they had this incredible, skill, which was literally learnt on the job. So you can imagine casting metal and having to freehand, learn motifs of architecture and to learn how to kind of, form them in sand and make repeat production to create the beautiful architecture that we look at in the South. These are extraordinary skills that were, mimetically learned because they weren't allowed to, read or write, etc., with the exception of a few. And so these skills became about this incredible profession that grew from having access to nothing, but could do extraordinary things. And I wanted to honor that. So if you look at the detail of the building, we took one of the kind of ironwork panels from Charleston and set up a way in which we could analyze the way in which the acanthus leaves in the forms touch the horizontal and vertical structural guides or frames of that panel system. And that we turned into a triangulated motif, which is the motif of the building. So the building is literally grafted from the work of an African American worker. So its very essence is that. And then what we did was just talk about, we live in a time where we're interested in environmental awareness. So this motif becomes denser or lighter depending on its orientation, because it stands as a classical form, four-sided. So in its southern exposure, it's 80% opaque, and its northern exposure, it's up to 60% transparent, et cetera, allowing visitors where circulation patterns are, it allows visitors, et cetera. So it's a kind of responsive thing, which is about now, but its origin and its very nature is talking about its past and, its past, its middle, and now its possible history. So, it's not a single answer. I'm trying to tell you that it's a complex thing, but it's absolutely talking about using the information and the narrative there to create the invention, rather than trying to create the invention, sort of scratching my head thinking about what I think could be that image. And I struggled when I tried to do it on my own, when I just say, what would be the image of a building for the African American community? It's like, what the hell does that mean? Actually, when you think about actually honoring the incredible moments and thinking about using one's creative energy to translate those moments, it became much more rewarding.
One more?
Hi. Before you talked about, your design of the African American Museum, taking like a traditionally small scale object and bringing it, blowing it up to a grander scale. But you yourself, traditionally you're an architect, but recently this summer you curated a collection of cloths at the Cooper Hewitt Museum, and you yourself have designed some fabrics yourself. So I'm interested to know, what have you drawn from your experiences as an architect, your experiences looking at these past forms, and what have you integrated into your own creation, when you're working on a scale that small?
I think that what architecture teaches you is the ability to translate information. I think at its very core, it teaches you to translate very immutable information, sometimes information that has no form, it's kind of formless, words, ideas, movements, and it teaches you to make those translations. I think when you get a great education, you're really skilled at that, I think. So for me, I'm permanently translating. So when I look at, when I did the Cooper Hewitt show, for instance, I selected textiles that I've actually directly referenced. I like textiles because there are two sort of narratives about the nature of architecture, right? That architecture, there's two thoughts. One is that it's a kind of primitive hut or something that becomes a kind of stone form. It's actually a fiction. It was a French fiction. Laugier invented it. But actually, maybe the archaeological evidence is of the notion of a stone temple that's made to, honor or thank a god for allowing you to take over a land or to be in a new place. It's kind of the beginnings of architecture. That's the stone monument, right? And then there's another one, which is the military one, which is the idea of the temporary encampment, the fabric that comes to a place and starts to dominate and becomes the language of a kind of inhabitation. So, people like Semper in Germany talks about this idea. So, there are these two very sort of powerful notions of what architecture can be. Is it a fabric? Is it a cloth? Or is it stone? Is it abstraction and pattern, or is it structure and form? It's inherent in our thesis if you read it, and I urge you to read it. So for me, the dialogue between the two is always something that I'm always moving between and thinking about. When is it a fabric, and when is it a stone? When is it memorializing, and when is it, kind of encapsulating a new position?
Thanks.
I think unless you can come up with an unbelievably brilliant question, perhaps our work here is done. Join me in thanking David Adjaye.
Thank you.